Right. If I keep looking over to the side, it's because I don't know how to get PowerPoint to use the right windows, the right machine monitors, whatever it is. Okay, so this is a talk called Works on My Machine. It's probably a famous saying now. It's especially if you work with any kind of software or computers. You guarantee stuff will work on your machine and not anywhere else. So the agenda for this talk, if I'm on the right window and I can use the arrow key, is I'm going to give a brief intro to containers as a concept, as I don't know, as whatever containers are. I'm going to go over the benefits of using containers. And then I'm going to go over the remote development extension, which is a VS Code extension, which helps you utilize containers. Dev containers specifically, and then we'll go over a demo, which will just be live, and we'll see what happens with the demo from there. So for me, this talk was around containers as a concept were totally alien to me. I mean, we've all heard of Kubernetes because it's the Lord and Savior of software development, right? Kubernetes fixes itself, it deploys itself, and we don't have to do things after that. That's a total lie. But for me, just getting my head around why I would use containers was as similar to why I would use Git, coming from a non-traditional CS background and coming from a system administration background where I wasn't doing software development. All of these kind of software development concepts and terminology is picked up along the way, and I mean, you might not necessarily have a need for it, but hopefully we'll explain a little bit about why I use containers and what the benefits are. So you've probably heard of Docker or seen the cute little whale, especially if you've contributed in Hacktoberfest. There's definitely stickers floating around as part of that. Docker is pretty much, has been the standard. It wasn't the first. And there's lots of other sort of containerized software solutions coming out. I think the first containerized solution I worked with was Cloud Foundry, which isn't as big. That was when I worked for an American software company. They were using that on-prem to do containerized solutions there. Since then, Docker, I think, is the biggest, or at least the most well heard of in the industry. There's others out there. There's Podman, I think, is getting quite a lot of attention at the moment since Docker came out and said that they were going to be charging people for licenses over certain thresholds and other things. Containerd, I think I've seen, and Rocket or RKT. I mean, they all pretty much do the same thing. They virtualize an environment so that you can run an application or a service inside a virtualized environment without having to worry about the underlying OS or hardware virtualized environment that it's running on. There's quite a bit of discussion around Windows versus Linux containers and the benefits and the do's and don'ts on those. I don't have a preference. When I was on a Windows machine as my daily machine, I would use both a combination of Windows and Linux, but just use what works for you. So before containers, or before virtualization in general, this is what your general stack would look like. You'd have a data center with a physical server in a rack with an operating system on top of it, and then the binaries and the libraries, and then the application would sit on top of that. The downside of that is there has to be a physical machine. Things have moved on a little bit since then, where obviously you can use a virtualized machine in the cloud, or an on-prem virtualized machine, which is not a single server per application. The downside of that is obviously deployment process was somebody actually has to go and plug wires in and do physical things with the server and interact with it. And obviously doing things like migrations and upgrades was a very manual and laborious process, which is not ideal. Obviously, we want to move fast. We want to deploy new versions. We want to do upgrades. We want to deliver value by doing it quickly. We probably all familiar with, or at least if you've been in the industry quite a while, sort of like annual upgrades and releases and things like that, and they never seem to go well. So we ended up moving from that to a virtualized environment still on a physical server, but then you added a hypervisor layer over that where you virtualized the guest OS so that you had to worry about less of the system underlying. So you could have multiple OSs on the same server running different OSs or the same OS, and then you could have applications installed on those. This is still similar to how we would deploy this. I mean, obviously, if you've been around a little while, you'll use like ESX from VMware or Hyper-V from Microsoft, which Hyper-V server is free, I believe. And I believe VMware ESX was free, or there was at least a free SKU that you could use. A lot of people running home labs and things to test and automate things and running up expensive electricity bills. And kind of this is where we are now with the container-based virtualization. So you have the container engine sitting on top of the host operating system rather than the hypervisor as such. Similar concept, but allows you to break down the runtime isolation of environments. So all you have to do is worry about the application and the libraries and everything you need to run the application, and it thinks it's its own entity when in actual fact it's shared resources on the underlying OS and system. I'm not going to dive deep into this. This is its own talk entirely. This is just to kind of give a background if you've never used Docker or containers in the past and the benefits that brings. So containers specifically, the benefit of those is, for me, the best thing is the onboarding experience if you're using a container. We all know when you start a company, you get given a laptop and then you're given a massive list of instructions that you have to install this, that, VS Code, Git, all these other things. Using containers is, from a development perspective, can massively reduce the time it takes for somebody to be productive. You have everything installed in an environment which they can just spin up. It's ephemeral and they don't have to worry about installing all the tools or different versions or having everything local. The environments are consistent between local and remote environments. So it works on my machine is no longer an excuse. So if I'm running a Docker container that has stuff running inside of it and then I want to share that with someone, I just have to provide them with the definition of the container, they spin it up and it has everything the same. Whereas if I was running that on my machine and doing a local build and I had a slightly different version of a dependency, somebody run it on their machine who has a different version, that's going to set itself on fire, and then you're going to spend hours looking for the inconsistency. And the beauty of that is with the remote environments is you can effectively run the same definition in production. So you can, whatever you're running in a container locally or I don't know, on a remote machine, you can run on a production environment. And then security. We've all heard of vulnerabilities coming out with pretty much everything. Whereas if you're running a container and everyone is using the same definition, you have to update that container image once, and then everybody's updated. Obviously, asking staff to update things, you're going to get some people who will comply, you're going to get some people who go, what if stuff breaks, and you're going to have a massive sprawl of compliance across the estate, which is terrible and from an audit perspective, but also from obviously a risk perspective as well. So concentrating on Docker specifically, this is the sort of terminology you'll see. You've got virtualization on Linux. It's sort of native process virtualization. On Windows and Mac OS, you've kind of got the virtualization hosted on a VM under the hood. You don't necessarily see that. If you're running it on Windows, you can see a VM in the network stuff underlying in the Hyper-V manager. But most of that is abstracted away from Docker when you install the Docker desktop application on your machine. You've got images, which is sort of the construct of the environment that you want to build. The image will contain the code you want to run, the runtimes, the libraries, the dependencies, everything that you need to run an environment. Registries are sort of where those images live. So you think now you've got like a NuGet feed or something like that, you would push a package up to there, then you would consume that package. The same concept with a registry. You build an image, the images built, packaged up, and then pushed to a registry, and then you can consume that from the registry. So you would do a Docker pull to consume that. It would pull down the image, build a container based off that image definition, and you would have a working environment, hopefully. Docker has a construct of a Docker file. Docker file is basically a line-by-line example of what the container image is going to look like. So you'll see on the top in that screenshot there, you've got mcr.microsoft.com. That's the registry, and then the /PowerShell. PowerShell is the image, and then the LTS Debian 10 is the tag of that image. So you can specify a version of the image in the registry as well. And then it goes through and it's got some arguments and some other bits and pieces that it does. We'll dive into that in a little bit, so we can see that in a bit more detail. If you want to publish a Docker image to, I don't know, Docker Hub or whatever, you would use a Docker file to do that, to declare how you want that to look. Now, if you're using VS Code and Docker and container images, there's a tool called the Remote Development Extension. The Remote Development Extension heavily utilizes Docker, and you'll see in the image there, on the left-hand side is your machine. You've got Visual Studio Code installed, and you've got your source code, which lives on, I don't know, a Git folder or a local file system. When you spin up a container to develop inside of, it spins up a VS Code server inside the container and then links your VS Code to that. And what that means is that you can install VS Code extensions inside the container rather than locally. So if you only have one project which requires, I don't know, a Ruby linter or a specific extension available in VS Code, that will live inside the container, so you don't have to keep that extension installed. And what that also means is that when you share the Docker image or the container definition with other people, it'll prompt them to install the extensions that they need to be able to build, test, and deploy your project. Any changes you make within there, within that environment, you can put that into the definition so that every time you build that environment, it's consistent. But it also passes through things like Git from your credential manager. If you use an SSH, you can allow it access to those as well. So the user experience of this using the remote development tools is that it looks like everything is local to your machine. The source code's local, the credentials are local, but it passes those into the container to use at runtime. You can do your normal operations. You get linting in there, you get syntax highlighting, you get the debugger, and it's just a really seamless way of doing development on a local machine without having all of the headache of dependencies and managing environments. It's all defined in the repository. It's all defined within the repository, and it's consistent. So if I and say Gary were working on the same project, we had a dev container or a Docker image, we know that what we're testing is consistent, unless obviously Gary goes off and changes something without telling me, but hopefully that would remain in the Git repository. The remote development extension has a concept. I don't believe a word you say, Gary. Open chat, I can see chat as well. This is magic. So the way that you declare a dev container within the remote development extension is you have a dev container.json. We're probably all familiar with JSON now. It's been around for quite a while, and the syntax is very familiar. There's also schema and syntax highlighting for this. So you'll see there the name in the Docker file. The name is the name of the container that it's when it spins up, and then the Docker file tells it that it's using a Docker file to build the image. You can set a couple of other things in there. So the settings is which shell you want to spin up in. By default, it normally uses Bash, but If you come from the Windows world or you do a lot of PowerShell, you can specify PowerShell to be your shell when you spin that up as well. The key thing for me in here is the extensions section. So when this spins up, it knows which extensions it needs for this project. So in this one particularly, it's going to be installing the PowerShell extension and then the Markdown lint extension. And then you've got other things in there. So you've got use forward ports so that you can expose ports from the container to the outside world. I'll not go into that in too much detail, but it's generally what you'll find in a container image or a dev container is there'll already be something in there if it needs to expose ports. So if you're building a web application, it'll expose a port so you can access the application on a local host port. And then the post create command is sort of when the container spins up, it's built the image and everything's running. It'll then run a command to install something, configure something. In this instance, it's running a build on a PowerShell module, installing any dependencies, and then it runs the initialize task, which will do standard set of unit tests, and then it'll finish. You can literally put anything in there. You could install, I don't know, the Azure CLI or whatever. There's other ways of doing that as well, but this makes it really easy. You abstract a lot of the logic around this into the Docker file, and then you can sort of parameterize this as well. I'll go into that in a bit more detail in the demos. Let's have a look. So you can actually, I've not really dug into the dev container stuff too in depth because I don't build applications as such. A lot of the stuff I'm working on is infrastructure automation, things like that. So I don't have massively complex environments, but you can tell it to use Docker or Kubernetes in there as well if you have a more complex scenario. The other good thing about this and the remote development extension as well is that you don't only have to spin up a Docker container. If you already have a remote machine which has SSH enabled, you can connect over SSH and load the local file system on a remote machine. So I've got a Raspberry Pi running there, which has a Pi-hole installed and a few other things. I'm actually running Docker on the Pi. So in order to get the Docker file on the Pi, I open the SSH session in VS Code and then edit the files in VS Code, but it's actually on the Pi, so that I don't have to mess around in the terminal. It's all a nice interface in there. So it's really flexible. It's really good. You can also, if you're on a Windows machine, use WSL, and you can use remoting into the WSL environment and configure things in there as well. So it gives you an interface you're used to with VS Code, without all the having to jump between PuTTY sessions or terminal interfaces to configure those things. And I mean, most importantly, it avoids having to use Vim. Nobody wants to use Vim, right? What are we on? Wow, I definitely should have had less coffee. I'm on the wrong machine. I don't mind Vim actually. I use it from the terminal quite a lot. Being on Mac, it's really easy. And then I think from there, I was just going to really dive into some demos on how I use it, the benefits of it, and see it in real life around how the benefit you can get from it. Have I got VS Code open already? I do. Okay. I'll just remove some of the distractions there. So one thing I could probably show you here is I've lost Teams. There it is. This is a Docker file, which we've got a new graduate at work, and I'm onboarding him with learning everything that there is to learn around Azure, PowerShell, C# infrastructure as code. And one of the things I had to do is he was trying to use a C# library in PowerShell. So as part of that, I had to I had to install a new package provider. Is that text big enough, or do I need to make it slightly bigger? Make it bigger anyway. So in order to consume this C# library, I had to register the NuGet package repository as a feed and install a package from the NuGet library, the NuGet package repository. You need to install the library from the NuGet, and then consume that in PowerShell. That's no mean feat. You have to do lots of digging around. So in order to prevent package, I apologise for the volume of my keyboard. That's not how you spell package. I have this installed locally, but in order to prevent having to install this library on my machine, I've actually, this is inside a Docker container. That's not how you do that either. That's not how you do that either. Anyway, this is a PowerShell Debian container that I'm running inside, and all I did to get inside that was docker run interactive mcr.microsoft.com is the registry, and then PowerShell, and that spins up an interactive Docker container that I can then interact with from the shell. You see PS version table 7.15, it will be the same here. I'm running 7.2 preview 5. So obviously, if anything that I do in my local environment, which is using this version, I wouldn't expect any of my colleagues to be running the latest preview versions of stuff. That's me experimenting. But if I was to publish something that only had stuff inside this environment, anything I provide to colleagues is going to break. It's not going to work. They might not have those features available to them. So when I was showing our new graduate this, I just spun up a Docker container, installed the libraries that I needed, registered the package provider, and then went through messing around with the package itself, so that I didn't have those DLLs installed on my machine. I'm probably not going to use them again. This was just for a small project that I had him working on, so I don't want to clutter my machine up with stuff that I'm not going to use regularly. Okay. What are we going to do? Let's make a new folder. Let's cd into that. Let's open the hand code. Right, so this is an empty folder. There's nothing in it. I've literally just created it. Let's bump this up a bit more so you can see it. When you install, you'll see in here the extensions I've got installed. That's not how you spell installed. I've got some stuff. I need to remove them actually because they don't work. That's no longer supported. But I've got a certain amount of extensions in here that I use on a daily basis, mainly lint and stuff, Azure stuff, because I use Azure quite regularly. But I haven't got like language specific stuff outside of PowerShell. I don't have a C# extension installed. This is the extension you would install. This is actually a meter extension, which consists of 3 other extensions. And those extensions are the remote SSH, remote containers, and remote WSL. I generally just install this top level one and get everything. Then I don't have to worry about which extension deals with what. Obviously, I don't have WSL on this machine because it's a Mac, but yeah, it's easier just installing one extension rather than installing 2. So what that gives you is once you've installed this, you might be able to see down here in the bottom left, there's like a little green icon, which when I hover over it, it says open a remote window. Let me just quit that. I don't have notifications turned off. So what that will do is in here, I don't have any files or folders. If I click that and click reopen in container, these are the default containers you get when you open this. The extension and the underlying container support around dev containers is open source. It's out there on GitHub. You'll get a defined list of images that you can pick from. So if you're a C# developer, you can spin up a C# Docker container from an image that is defined within this extension. And then likewise, if you just need a basic Debian one with Git installed, or if you're doing Java or Node.js, so all of these various other things, Ruby. I don't know if you've ever installed Ruby on Windows. Installing Ruby on Windows is not a very easy process, and this is actually how I first started using this extension, because I started using GitHub Pages for my blog whilst I was on a Windows machine, and to test that locally, I had to install Ruby and Jekyll and all these other things, and it just did not play nice. So I started using Docker to do it, because it was a much nicer experience. At the bottom, if you click Show All Definitions, there's more in here. Salesforce. There's a Jekyll one there so when I write a new blog post now, I spin my blog up inside a Docker container, debug it locally, and then I can spin up a local host version of that before I push any changes out to GitHub for GitHub Pages to build that. It's really handy because VS Code does nice Markdown preview stuff, but there's some differences between local Markdown and GitHub Pages, so it's nice to see that actually published. And the other one I use quite a lot is Azure Functions. I do a lot of serverless Azure Functions for managing infrastructure, and you get the different flavors of those as well. PowerShell, Node.js, Java. I think what we'll probably build an Azure Function one today, and then you get to see Azure Functions as well as the dev container stuff and how that works. Hopefully I've got a recent image and it doesn't have to pull an entire image down, but we'll see. Ruby, R, Python with Postgres, Puppet development kit. That's me watch telling us that I need to move because I haven't moved in the past 10 minutes. Markdown editing, Juliet, there's literally anything, and the beauty of this is, so you can define your own because it's just JSON and a Docker file. You don't have to use one of these. What I generally do, because I'm not a Docker expert by any stretch of the imagination, what I generally do is if I need to build a Docker file for me, I'll build one from their definition. So if I need Azure CLI, Terraform, and a couple of others, I'll just have a look at how they've defined the Docker file and then kind of mash two Docker files together and hope it builds. I mean, you don't need to be a Docker expert to be able to run this. Most of the definitions are pretty simple. So I think what we'll do is we'll build an Azure Functions one. Yeah, Chrissy, this is the remote development extension. Gary's posted it in the chat there. And I've been using this for ages, and when I got a new machine last year, I made a point of making sure that everything went into a Docker container. Running Azure Functions, you have to install .NET SDKs, and then obviously as Azure Functions is following the life cycle of the underlying .NET, you end up with different versions of the .NET SDK, which is required, and then obviously you quickly get into a situation where an Azure function I built 12 months ago is using .NET, an older version of the .NET SDK, and then I need to have both installed. So doing that inside Docker that lives with the repo. The one from 12 months ago still works because the .NET SDK doesn't live on my machine. It lives in a Docker container, which is defined in the repo. So whether it's 12 months old or brand new, they both work in the environment that they were built in because all the dependencies are contained within. So what we'll do is, just to give you an idea, reopen in container, we'll go show all Azure Functions and PowerShell. Now that'll go away, it'll give you a prompt, you can have a look at the container, you can see it's doing run docker build using that, it's pulling the latest Azure Functions PowerShell 3 core tools, and the way that Docker naturally works is an image starts off as a base image, as if you were building a Linux machine or a Linux VM, and then the image definitions after that are applied in layers. So the base image might pull from a Debian image, but then Microsoft might be installing the tools that they need, and then somebody else might define a Docker image on top of that. A Docker file on top of that. So you end up pulling from an image 3 iterations ago, but it's built in sequential steps. Clearly, I haven't installed the latest Docker image for quite a while. But the beauty of this and how this ties into open source, which is while that's building, is that the first time I used Docker without this extension, so the first time I used it with the extension in dev containers was for my blog, but it was about 3 years ago. I was trying to contribute to an open source project, and they had a PowerShell module out on GitHub. I was like, I'm going to contribute to this. I'm going to update the tests, but I didn't want to install all the dependencies. They had like 3 or 4 dependent modules in there. So I just spun up a Docker container to do that, built it there, changed the code, and then was testing it inside the Docker container. Installed the extension. Chocolate Doc's working through this extension as well. Yeah, it's really good, Chrissy, and because it's so integrated with Visual Studio Code, it's a lot of the complexity is abstracted away from you. So you don't need to think too much about it, especially if you're just using one of the base images that are defined there. I'll show you a couple of links in the chat later on, but you can find the base images, and what you can actually do as well is Microsoft show you which images they've pulled as part of this. So the Azure Functions one will have a base image which is up there on Docker Hub that you can go and see the Docker file. So I've spent a little bit of time digging through Docker files, trying to mash everything together to get a working container. Where this falls down a little bit, I'm busy trying to build a Teams bot and a Teams extension for work. Some of the web elements of that use ephemeral ports, so that the extension gets a little bit confused when I try and debug the project, because it just picks a random port which might not be defined in the dev container. So I have to kind of figure out what that port it's going to use and then add it at runtime to get it to do that. But the beauty of that is I opened an issue on the GitHub repository and asked, is this a known issue? And then somebody responded saying this is how you work around it, and we'll look at seeing how we can fix that. Because it's all open source, you can contribute to that. So this looks like it's finished. What you get as part of that is you get the dev container.json. You can see the name is Azure Functions in PowerShell, and that's this name that it gives the container itself when it spins up. You can tell it's using the Docker file, and this argument is when it spins up the Docker file, it'll pass this version into it, and all that's doing is telling the Docker file which version of PowerShell it wants to spin up in. When this first came about, PowerShell 6 was the latest release. Since moved up to PowerShell 7, they actually contributed the first one to that to get a container working, because there wasn't one for PowerShell. So I opened a pull request and contributed that to the actual extension itself, so that it comes as a standard base image. I then generalized that so you could use any version of PowerShell within there. So previously it had like a v6 version and a v7 version. Generalized that so you can just specify that at runtime. This is the port forwarding that I mentioned. So obviously it's spinning up in a Docker container, which is its own isolated environment. All this says is expose this port to the outside world so that I can connect to the container on this port, and it passes that inside the container. Now that's handy for doing local debugging of Azure Functions. You'll get to see how that works in a bit. And then actually this dev container defines this as PowerShell rather than Bash. It tells the Docker container to install the Azure Functions extension and the PowerShell extension, and then the remote user. There's a lot more things you can put in there. So like you see there, how the post create command is .NET restore. If you're working on a C# project, you could get it to do the restore as soon as it spins up the container. So you're not going, why am I getting underlined squigglies on me using statements? The other thing in there is the Docker file. Now this is the generalized bit. All that's saying is that's the argument for using PowerShell 7. They give you a link to the actual GitHub repository where this is pulled from. So it pulls this as your functions, PowerShell, this version of the core tools with PowerShell 7, and then it builds it up in layers. So it'll pull the Buster definition underneath, and then it goes through the Azure Functions definition. And then if I wanted to add anything to this, I could add more stuff under here to install more things if I wanted to upgrade or install specific extensions that I was going to be using. So what you get as part of that is it loads up in this workspaces directory. This is inside the container. You can see it's PowerShell 7.03, which is the LTS version that's using. I'm still on 7.2 preview 5. So this emulates what Azure Functions is going to be using in Azure. When you push those changes, you know that you're going to be testing it on a sensible version. What you also get with that is, because it's installed the Azure Functions image, you'll get the Functions CLI tool, which I don't think I've got installed locally. Yeah, I don't have that installed locally because all of the functions work that I do is inside a container. Therefore, why have a CLI that I'm not going to use clogging up my local machine? You get cool ASCII art in there. They've since removed that in newer versions. But it's the same for the Azure CLI. I think that should be installed here as well. Part of the core tools. Yeah, you get the Azure CLI installed there as well. So what we can do is we can define a new Azure Functions project in here. No, func init, which initializes a new project. And within Azure Functions, you get the choice of languages. So there, obviously, when I went through those definitions for the containers, you get .NET, Python, PowerShell. And we'll do PowerShell. And you can see that's created git ignore host local sentence profile. And this actually creates it on the local file system because it mounts the volume of this directory inside the container. So this doesn't go away with the container. Obviously, one of the things about containers, or one of the benefits, is that the ephemeral environments, that you can just destroy them and spin them up. But obviously, you run into an issue where you want to maintain information once that's gone away, and one of those is the local repo. So this is actually on your local machine, and then we'll do func new. So I've initialized that directory as a new functions project, and I want to spin up a new function inside the function app. And I don't know why it gives you two options with different capitalization, but I'm going to choose one so Chrissy doesn't shoot us. And then the options you get for spinning up an Azure function, I don't know. I don't know how many people are familiar with Azure Functions. It's basically a serverless function, or a Lambda if you're more familiar with AWS. And these are all the triggers that you can configure. Some of these work better than others locally. Obviously, if things like Kafka or RabbitMQ or SendGrid inputs, they have external dependencies. Some work better debugging locally. But just to give you an idea, we'll do an HTTP trigger. Yeah, that was not going to be that great. So this is all inside the container. This is a local folder. It's added everything in there. So without going into too much detail about the functions, you get a scaffolded function in here. I can kill that terminal now. This is starting up PowerShell Integrated Console. And you see there, that's still 7.0.3. That's still inside the container. The integrated terminal launched when I opened this. And then you've got a function which takes in an API or an HTTP request, checks for query parameters, and then returns an output. That just defines the inputs and outputs of the function. So technically what you should be able to do is you should just be able to debug this, he says. You get a prompt because it's the first time it was created outside of VS Code. So click yes to initialize that. That'll add some stuff in here which allows you to debug it. And then if you do run attach to PowerShell functions, this calls into the func CLI and does a func host start, which spins up the host. Takes in some environment variables. It might take a little while if I forgot to. Oh no, it's already commented out. That's good. So when this first came about, it had the entire AZ PowerShell module uncommented in here. That didn't work for some reason. It's still running. I think it's just the task failed for some reason. Yeah, that AZ module would try and install on the first time you span it up locally, when that AZ module is massive, so it would take like 5 minutes before you could actually get it debugging. And what you can do here is if I copy this link, I'll just open it in browser actually. I don't know if you can see that. This HTTP trigger function executed successfully. So you can see here, this is spinning up on the local host and on that 7071 port that we exposed in the dev container JSON in here. So all that says is inside the Docker container, I want 7071 available to the outside world. Obviously, I'm running Firefox locally on my machine. And then what you can do is you could do name equals Hacktoberfest. Call that again. Hello Hacktoberfest. This triggered, executed successfully. Now for those, one of the other good things about functions, which is massively relevant at the moment, will contribute to some, no, that's not how we do that, to some open source. If I reopen the terminal on that, when I save this, you should get hot reload. I'm going to refrain from commenting any further on. Or contribute to some open source. So from a debugging perspective, you want to touch any nerves? From a debugging perspective, it's a really good feedback loop. Like you get all of this interactivity. I haven't had to install the func CLI. This requires a .NET SDK to be installed. I haven't had to install that. I literally span up new Azure functions with all of those dependencies in the space of 5 minutes, the time it took to download that Docker image and container and all of the dependencies as part of that. For me, this makes like the development life cycle of something like this so beneficial. It's shortening the feedback loop. I can debug this locally. Even if you've used Azure Functions and you want to interact with a storage account, there's an application or a product called Azurite, which you may be familiar with, which allows you to connect to a local storage emulator to do storage related things. And actually, I spent ages trying to define the Docker file in here to install Azurite on a Linux OS, because this is obviously running a Linux Docker container. And what I've realized is if you search in here, the Azurite VS Code extension actually installs it for you when you install this extension under the hood. So all I did was come in here, go to the dev container JSON, and where's that extension gone? It's this one, Azurite. Dev container JSON, and I just defined that in there. And then what you can do as part of that, if you want to spin that up, you can just click that, click rebuild container. It'll look at the definition, it'll go, oh look, you've already got all of those things, but it also needs Azurite as well. So I'll go away and I'll install that in the background for you. Like I literally didn't have to do anything with the Docker file. After about 6 hours of trying, I was like, that's much easier. You'll see here that Azurite actually needs another port forwarded. I don't know if it's done it automatically, don't know. So I would have to add another port in here, so that I could connect to that, because what that would do. I haven't got it open at the moment, but there's an application called Azure Storage Explorer, which allows you to connect to that as a local emulator, so that you don't have to actually reach out to Azure for a storage account. That lets you interact with table storage, and there's actually storage queues as well if you are doing queue-based operations. So it's the benefit of this as well is if I was to commit this repo up to a remote repository in GitHub, and then I went to Chrissy, I've shown you how to use Azure Functions, and all you have to do is install this. And actually in here, does this have? In this VS Code folder, when it prompted me before to initialize this as a VS Code repository, Chrissy could clone this repository. This VS Code folder would come down with it, and when she opened this in VS Code, it would say, this project requires these extensions, and it would install them for her. Or what you'd be more likely to do is when you spin this container up. So if I close all this, let's have a look. Save, whatever, and then close that. If I close this window, close that window, go back to my terminal and do code dot. The experience you get when you clone a repository which has these definitions in. You see the dev containers there, the VS codes there. It'll say the folder contains a dev container configuration file. Would you like to reopen it in a container? And then it goes, okay, there you go. That's inside a container now. It tells you that there's been some changes, so you could rebuild that, or you could just ignore the message for the time being. And then within there, you've got your function, and then you should just be able to, once this spins up, that coffee's cold. You should just be able to debug this extension. You get all the configuration that I defined when I configured that repository, so that you can just debug this. You don't have to install anything. You don't have to think, how do I debug this? You've just cloned that repository. You've got a development environment inside a container. You've got all the extensions that you need in order to be productive within, what, 10 minutes, because you might not have downloaded that container image. And then open in browser. It doesn't work because it hasn't given the full path. It's just given that, but you can open that. You can open that. Name equals. Go contribute to open source. Now, for me, I've been doing a lot of work around Azure Functions, and this has helped me no end. It just such a vast improvement on going in here, right-clicking, deploy to function app, wait for it to spin up in the cloud, get the public URL, then test that. The other thing you can do in here is you can set breakpoints like you would any other. So when I don't know if they'll pick the breakpoint up immediately, but if we just debug that. Let's close that, let's close that. Let's open that and go back to the project. Yeah, whatever. It hasn't triggered. There's something wrong with the launch configuration on there for some reason. But you can, I do have to do a weird debugger. Save that. Let's see it. Hot reload, it'll be like, okay. And if I go back to this, Is it stepping into the debugger? It's kind of paused. Doing the whole debuggy thing or not? Apparently not. Debugger seems to have stopped, that's why. What's that? What's that? Right, open that. Stop the debugger. I was selling that so well up until this point. But so when you interact with this and you call it from the browser, it'll actually break on this point, and you can query the variables like you would normally. I don't know why that's not working, but it will just sit in the browser waiting for you to step over it, and then you can debug into those as well. So if you've got a bit more of a complex function, you can step through that as if you would it was a local script, and the browser just waits for that operation to finish. So yeah, I think the other benefit to call out as part of that is this dev container instance actually works with GitHub code spaces. So if Chrissy's on an iPad and I've built a project and said, Chrissy, check this out, and she's got access to GitHub code spaces, she could clone this repository and use it directly in code spaces because it uses this, it understands this dev container definition. So you don't even have to have VS Code or this repository local on your machine. You can do it all in browser through code spaces. I haven't checked the new VS Code.dev that kind of came out this week, but I would imagine the technology underneath that is using code spaces, so you should be able to open that. Thanks, Paul. Yeah, I was keeping an eye on that. So to me, this is a no-brainer. Why you would? I don't know why you wouldn't use this. My Mac doesn't have anything installed on it that I don't need. I don't have to then go and have a clear out beside the Docker images every now and then, but compared to managing different versions of the SDKs, it also means I can spin up different container runtimes for Python, PowerShell, C# if I really want, and debug them independently. So I've got some C# Azure functions running, which I can debug locally in the same manner. So for me, it's a no-brainer. And then because you get all of that definition living in the repository, if I want to go and contribute to an open source project, I don't have to install all their stuff to do that, which obviously during Hacktoberfest, actually one of the things I have done before, I've opened pull requests to define a dev container definition for a project that I've used when I've been contributing to it. And then it means anybody else that contributes after that uses this can contribute as well. And the beauty of it is none of this is mandatory. So even if this is in the container and they don't use this extension or they don't use remote dev tools, doesn't matter. They don't need to use it. They can still do stuff locally. I think I've covered everything that I wanted. How do you use PowerPoint again? Current slide. Yay! That's me. I don't know if there's any questions specifically around that, whether there's something I maybe brushed over and you'd like to know more of, or I tried not to get too into the weeds with Docker and functions per se, but kind of showed the benefit of using the Docker environment to do that development. If there's any questions, I mean, there's only a handful of us. Please come off mute or post in chat.
Hello. I loved this, and it was exactly what I needed, and I meant it when I said that I wanted to clone that repo. So please do commit this to a repo so that I could clone it.
I will.
Because that just took care of everything, and I could just like learn it at my own pace.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Obviously, each element of that is probably its own talk in general about Docker, about containers, about functions and things, but trying to keep it high level enough where it just shows the benefit of using that, and especially part of open source. You know what it's like. So my grad this week, I was like, yeah, you need to spin up Azure functions, and he went, it doesn't work. And I was like, what version of the .NET SDK have you got installed? He was like, 5 point something or other. And I was like, yeah, you need 3.1 for this. So he had to go away and install another SDK just to, and I mean, there was part of us really wanted to start down there, no use Docker. But I also wanted he's also like drinking from the fire hose, learning Terraform and PowerShell and C# and like all of our products. So I was like, I'm not about to go, by the way, you should be doing all this. So yeah, just the benefit for me is just massive. And now my process of defining a project, or when I start a project, is I create a folder, I do a Git init to initialize it as a Git repository, and then I'll open it as a dev container inside VS Code, even if that's just a PowerShell project or a PowerShell module. So I've been looking at Brandon Olin's Stucco project as part of Hacktoberfest to build. It's basically build PowerShell modules as a PowerShell module. It's a little bit meaty. And what that actually does, his project builds you a PowerShell module, and one of the prompts on there is, do you want a dev container with this? And if you say yes, it'll build you a repo for a PowerShell module with build, test, deploy, GitHub Actions, platypus documentation, and you'll have a dev container instance to run it. Now, what he didn't have a dev container instance on the Stucco repository outside of the template. So I ran into an issue with the Pesta version. I ended up building his Stucco module inside a dev container to build a module which gave me a dev container. And I was like, I don't know where I am now, but this is great.
Did it work?
It worked, yeah. So I was able to, actually, Gilbert Sanchez actually put the pull request in to fix the issue, but for me to test his, I cloned the repo, I checked out his fork of that, built it inside the dev container, then built a module with the dev container, which proved that it fixed the issue. And I didn't need all of the PowerShell sort of dependencies that it comes with. And then I just closed VS Code and it all went away, and I didn't have to worry about it. And it was
living in the future.
Yeah, I mean, story of my life. Just do something and then throw it away.
Love it.
So yeah, I'll commit this, and the slides. Obviously, the slides could probably do with a little bit of refinement, but based on the fact that they're only 4 hours old, I'll not complain.
I was very impressed. I don't know how you brought that all together.
But yeah, the demos are kind of where it comes in, and I'll push those to a repo. I don't know if we've got a central Hacktoberfest one, or I'll just push it to mine.
Sweet, thank you.
And because I've got PowerPoint open, I can't see what time it is. And I think we've got 2 minutes spare.
Yeah, sweet, nice job.